This lecture will focus on Unit 1, Key Issue 3. Why are different places similar? We're going to be focusing on three new concepts: scale, space, and connection. Scale is the relationship between the portion of Earth being studied and Earth as a whole. We can make sense of this through globalization, which is a force or process that involves the entire world. Economic globalization is pretty easy to understand, as we're familiar with many transnational corporations that produce products that we consume every day. Some would include McDonald's, Toyota, Sony, and Coca-Cola. Globalization can have both positive and negative influences on culture. Globalization can potentially threaten local cultural beliefs, forms, and traits with extinction. Globalization can put some countries or regions at an advantage and some at a disadvantage. Globalization separates countries into the core and the periphery. Countries that are in the core might include the United States, Canada, and other countries in Western Europe. Countries in the periphery would include countries that might be in Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. Core countries typically dictate the global economy, and periphery countries are submissive to it. Although globalization can threaten local culture, it can, on the other hand, also promote local diversity. McDonald's is an example of a transnational corporation that can compare cultural globalization and local diversity. McDonald's, like many fast food restaurants, service stations, and retail chains, deliberately create a visual appearance that varies among locations as little as possible. This is often viewed as tainting the genuine cultural landscape of a country. On the other hand, McDonald's also has a vested interest in appealing to the preferences of people who live in local communities within other countries. For example, in India, you can get a paneer chicken wrap. And if you look at the kitchens in the McDonald's of India, you'll find that vegetarian dishes are cooked completely separately from dishes that include chicken. Beef is also not included on the menu to adhere to Hindu restrictions. Another example we can use to compare cultural globalization versus local diversity would be the expansion of television and the internet. TV, for example, was once limited to a handful of channels displaying one set of cultural values. With the distribution of programming through cable, satellite, and the internet, people now can choose from hundreds of programs in many languages. What kinds of shows are prevalent in your household? My mother happens to be from the Philippines, so at her household, the only channel that plays is the Filipino channel, also known as TFC. And there's no doubt that access to that programming helps her feel better connected to her culture. Let's look at an example of economic globalization that's in your textbook. This image can be found on page 20. It's figure 1-25. We're looking at the transnational corporation Procter & Gamble. Look at the facilities that are located all over the globe. This is where factories are located. Procter & Gamble produces products like health and beauty products as well as food products. This is one of the largest American consumer goods corporations, supplying products all over the world. These next images come from page 21, and they're figures 1-26 and 1-27. Looking at McDonald's in the map, you can find that the United States, Canada, some Western European countries, China, and Japan all have 1,000 or more McDonald's restaurants. And as I mentioned before, the restaurants try to take on this uniform landscape so that they are familiar and they're easily identifiable so that consumers can frequent there. However, if you look at the menus of the restaurants in these different countries, they all look very different depending on what the food preferences may be in those countries. Now we're going to talk about the distribution of features in space, looking at density, concentration, and pattern. Let's first talk about the difference between density and concentration. We can use figure 1-28 located on page 22 of your textbook to get a better understanding. The three images you see here are examples of three different neighborhoods. It's clear that the density of the houses in B and C are a lot higher than that of A. However, if we're trying to understand the difference between density and concentration, we want to look at B and C. B and C share the same area space, as well as the same number of houses. However, when we look at how the houses are spaced out in B, they're much more further apart. When we look at how they're spaced out in C, we see a concentration of those houses very close together. And this may be done to allocate space for a community park, for example. That's the difference between density and concentration. We can apply those concepts to better understand cultural identity across space. Let's take a look at this map of Los Angeles. This map can be found on page 24 of your textbook. It's figure 1-31. What we're looking at is the distribution of ethnicities in Los Angeles. And we can tell that this distribution displays clustering or concentration. Take a look at the key. At least 50% of this ethnic group is prevalent in the colors associated with it on the map. Geographers study these cultural traits because they are important in explaining why people sort themselves out in space and move across the landscape in distinctive ways. They also help us better understand patterns in space. Patterns in space vary according to gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. Let's take a look at figure 1-32, located on page 24 of your textbook. This map indicates the distribution of LGBT people in the United States, and we notice that it is not uniform. Take a look at the key. The darker the colors, the higher the percent self-identifying as LGBT statewide. We can also look at the cities that seem to be more friendly toward the LGBT community. We notice that there's a much larger community that resides there. Among the 50 largest U.S. cities, the percentage of LGBT people varies from 6.2% in San Francisco to 2.6% in Birmingham. San Francisco has a reputation for being an especially hospitable city for the LGBT people. Not surprisingly, is the highest percentage of openly LGBT people among the 50 largest U.S. cities. Interesting fact, did you know that our governor, Gavin Newsom, used to be the mayor of San Francisco, and back in 2004 gave permission for clerks to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples? It wasn't until 11 years later that marriage equality was achieved at the federal level. When we look at cultural identity across space, we can also look at gender. Figure 1-34, located on page 25 of your textbook, compares the average income of women being lower than men everywhere in the world, with greater inequality in some places. If you look at this map, the darker purple areas indicate less inequality, and the lighter shades indicate more inequality. There is a difference, however, in your developed countries and your less developed countries. The countries with closer equality are primarily in poorer countries where both male and female incomes are pretty low. This includes countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Countries where incomes are higher and equity between men and women happen to be higher as well on the basis of income would include Canada, some Scandinavian countries, and Australia. A major human geography concept that we're going to explore in more depth later in the semester is inequality. Let's apply inequality to space. Figures 1-35 and 1-36 both indicate that inequality is growing both internationally as well as in the United States. The first graph looks at income growth, comparing developing countries to developed countries and how that compares to the world. Let's look at the purple line. The developed countries seem to be growing at a much higher rate. Now let's look at the green line. Yes, developing countries are also growing in income level, but we also have to consider another thing. What are the standards of living? What is the cost of living? Does it cost more to survive? And that's something that we have to ask ourselves, even though it may seem like every country in the world is increasing their per capita income. What we see here is uneven development, and many would argue that this is the result of globalization, or at least the way in which it's set up, where you have core countries that benefit and periphery countries that adhere. Let's look at figure 1-36. Inequality in the United States looks at wealth and poverty. The share of U.S. wealth held by the wealthiest 1% declined from the 1930s through the 1970s and began rising in the 1980s. The percentage of people living in poverty declined during the 1960s, but has remained relatively unchanged since then. Many have argued that the concentration of wealth in the top 1% of people in the United States has come at the detriment of increasing standards of living for the majority of people. And the fact that the percentage of poverty has remained the same since the 1960s may speak truth to that. We can continue to see patterns of inequality in the United States in figure 1-37 on page 27 of your textbook. This map looks at inequality among children in low-income households. Children who grew up in households with family incomes around $30,000 are at age 26 earning on average more than $30,000 in counties in blue and less than $30,000 in counties in red. What this means is ultimately children born to low-income households experience inequality of opportunity based on their location. One of the factors that contribute to the inequality of opportunity is on the basis of education. Property taxes are a major way that districts get funded. Lower income communities generate lower property taxes. And lower property taxes means that the schools in those counties are underfunded. The next concept we're going to cover is diffusion, as it relates to connection. We're going to be looking at two types of diffusion, relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. Then we're going to talk about the subcategories that are under expansion diffusion. Let's first look at relocation diffusion. This is the movement of people or things. When they move, they carry with them culture, including language, religion, and ethnicity. When I think of relocation diffusion, I think of colonization or migration. Expansion diffusion is the outward spread of a feature, and there are three subcategories: hierarchical, which follows a network; contagious, which is rapid and widespread; and stimulus. Let's break down these three. Hierarchical diffusion is the spread of an idea from persons or nodes of authority or power to another person or place. Contagious diffusion is the rapid, widespread diffusion of a characteristic throughout the population. And lastly, stimulus diffusion is the spread of an underlying principle, even though a characteristic itself apparently fails to diffuse. I'm going to use some examples in our discussion. The last topic we're going to cover is spatial interaction as it relates to connection. We're going to talk about three major concepts: network, distance decay, and space-time compression. This map, figure 1-41, located on page 30 of your textbook, indicates a network. This is a chain of communication that connects places. This is a way in which major airports can be used as ways to connect other smaller cities to each other. Now let's look at the concept of distance decay. Distance decay implies that the further apart two places are, the less influence they're going to have on each other. Space-time compression, however, has proved that advances in transportation, communication, and other forms of technology have helped minimize that distance decay. Distance decay would have been much stronger during times when people used sailboats and postmail, but space-time compression has minimized the influence of distance decay. So now we can communicate with people across the world through telephone or the internet. We can also easily travel to other countries across the globe on an airplane. This is the end of the lecture on Unit 1, Key Issue 3. Please be prepared for the discussion to follow.